what I would like to do is address the broad question of why there is a war looming against China. I mean, in some ways, you could also say that the war on China has already begun, and ultimately, it is not going to be a win for the United States. But of course, if it is attempted, if a military conflict is actually attempted, it has the potential not only to do a lot of damage, but to bring the world to nuclear war. So the title that we were given is Geopolitics and Political Economy, the Looming War Against China. And I would just say right at the start that I think it would probably be better to call it Geopolitical and Political Economy for a couple of reasons. One, the very idea of geopolitics tends to be dominated, or the field that is known as geopolitics tends to be dominated by extremely right-wing tendencies in writing, and in reality, it also tends to separate something called geopolitics from something else called geoeconomics, which does not make sense. Good critical writers, including writers like Marx and other important Marxists, actually studied political economy, and that's why I've coined the term geopolitical economy to try to understand how economics, politics, the two most important things, and then other things as well, combine in a historical whole. We have to understand it as an evolving historical whole. And that's why I've proposed this new approach to world affairs. So anyway, that's why it's better to call it geopolitical and political economy. So what I would like to do is address the broad question of why there is a war looming against China, but also why it is destined to be messy, contradictory, and confused, much as the current proxy war on Russia is all those things: messy, contradictory, confused. I mean, in some ways, you could also say that the war on China has already begun, if by war we understand not just military operations, but also hostilities across a range of fields: trade and technology, finance, ideology. All of these things are already going on. There is already a war against China. Indeed, the war against China may be just looming, but as we know, the one against Russia is already taking place. And as I say, it is also a very messy war. To begin with, it's a proxy war. It's not an outright war. Everybody knows that it's a war between the United States and Russia, but it is being conducted through the instrument of Ukraine. And as Professor Mearsheimer has pointed out, the United States seems determined to fight Russia to the last Ukrainian. That is to say, Ukraine is the instrument and also the sacrifice in this war. The two are also related. Very many prominent thinkers have related them. Henry Kissinger, for example, has said that the United States is going to war against China and Russia, or is imminently going to go to war against China and Russia. And many others have also made the analogy of the Ukraine war with China. That is to say, just as the United States has gone to war against Russia over Ukraine, so the United States can be expected to go to war against China over Taiwan. Why is there a looming war on China? The short answer is the United States made a big mistake and then went, oops. What do I mean by that? What I mean is that in the 1990s, in the post-Cold War period, from the 1990s onwards, the United States began a long engagement with China. The United States said to deal with human rights problems with China is to engage with China, etc. And much of this engagement was actually at the behest of US corporations who wanted to invest in China and who wanted to outsource in China. So both foreign direct investment and outsourcing began to increase in this period. Chinese exports to the United States began to increase as well. And the two became so integrated that by the early 2000s, some writers, I'm thinking of Niall Ferguson and Schularik, talking about chimerica. That is the idea that the United States and China had become so integrated, they constituted a kind of a single system. And all this engagement had taken place on the grounds that essentially, on the US assumption that essentially China would become and remain a subordinated producer of low-cost, cheap manufactured goods. And not only that, it would over time become increasingly neoliberal. So essentially it would lose its communist character, its socialist character, and essentially become a subordinated neoliberal third world economy, which would always know its place and, supply the United States with what it wanted. But of course, by the late 2000s, particularly after the 2008 financial crisis, when the United States went into a deep recession, while China was able to turn its giant economy on a dime and continue growing. And not only that, over the last decade and more, it has become increasingly clear that China had absolutely no intention of remaining a subordinated, low technology, low cost, cheap labor producer, and has increasingly presented technological challenges to the United States. So China has not only an export surplus with the United States, which is a persistent and growing one, but it also now represents a technological challenge. So essentially, this was the kind of the oops moment. Already during the George Bush Jr., you had George Bush Jr. imposing tariffs on Chinese textiles and steel and what have you, on the grounds that the Chinese were dumping these goods on the United States. Then under Obama, you had the pivot to Asia. Then under Trump, of course, you had essentially the launching of a veritable trade war against China. And now, of course, everybody thought when Biden was elected that Biden would represent a more sensible, more peaceable policy towards China. Nothing doing. Biden has not only continued the policies of Trump, but in fact, he has intensified the economic, trade, technological confrontation, and also added a thick layer of military confrontation on top of that. So you have the offensive visits of US officials and office holders to Taiwan, for instance, the increasing saber rattling across a range of different things, the publication of documents that say China is our chief strategic competitor as well as adversary, and so on and so forth. And above all, you have the creation of new alliances such as AUKUS, etc., and the extension of NATO's remit to what's now being called the Indo-Pacific. Indo-Pacific only because the United States still hopes to drag India into an alliance with China. So this is the reason why a war is looming against China. This is the way in which it has unfolded. But to me, to understand why we are here, why there is a looming war against China, why there is an actual war, or even if it's a proxy war against Russia, we need to take a longer and deeper look. And also, this longer and deeper look will help us to understand why it's going to be messy, confused, and contradictory like the one on Russia. And NATO provides us with a good segue, because in order to understand the deeper causes of the current situation, we have to put the United States and its world role, and NATO as its principal instrument of its world role in the longer history of imperialism. Now, that longer history itself is much misunderstood. The mainstream simply denies the existence of any such thing. It basically, if it talks about imperialism at all, it reduces it to formal colonialism, so that today, the poverty, the low productive level of so many countries in the world, the third world or the world majority, whatever you want to call it, is essentially blamed on their own original sin of backwardness. And even when talking about colonialism, what happens is that it sort of praised with faint condemnation, if we might say. That is to say, it is barely condemned. And sometimes it is even celebrated, if for nothing else than for integrating the world into a single whole. That is to say, its subordination is celebrated as imperialism, because that is what it means when people say silly things like the decades before 1914 was the first wave of globalization. It was not no such thing. These were the decades of imperialism, of intensified imperialism and imperial competition among various countries. So this is the problem with the mainstream, but even critical views of imperialism have a problem, which is why I've had to propose this new critical view of looking at imperialism and the evolution of the world order of capitalism in the form of geopolitical economy. Very briefly, what are those problems? Well, first of all, ultimately, all these critical views, for reasons I've explored in my book, ultimately fail to understand how the roots of imperialism lie in the dynamics of capitalism itself. And they are unable to understand it because they separate economics from politics and every other economics from society, from politics, etc., etc. Some even go so far as to say, and these people who call themselves Marxists, they say that imperialism is not necessary to capitalism. And others who can't accept this, thank God, however, continue to try to examine imperialism, but are extremely hazy about its roots in the dynamics of capitalism. As a result, many also end up fixating on some isolated element like capital exports. How can capital exports be the centerpiece of any theory of imperialism when the United States, rather than exporting capital, is sucking capital? It's a sinkhole for the world's capital from all over the world. It just does not make sense. In this understanding also, imperialism is regarded as a historical constant. You show how radical you are by essentially saying imperialism is very powerful and it is as powerful today as it was before, etc. And finally, they also end up accepting the narrative of US hegemony. This narrative, in fact, is extremely problematic. The real story, in fact, is very different. Imperialism, as I've argued in a number of my writings, including Geopolitical Economy and Capitalism, Coronavirus and War, and many articles, is rooted in the contradictions of capitalism. Essentially, capitalism is not a self-sustaining system. It is not a self-contained system. Its contradictions make it expansionist because capitalism cannot satisfy the conditions of its existence within the territory of any single economy, no matter how large it may be. And what capitalism tends to want from the rest of the world is that the rest of the world accept the excess capital and excess commodities produced by major capitalist countries, while at the same time supply those capitalist countries with cheap labor and cheap raw materials. Essentially, the purpose of imperialism, therefore, ends up becoming to open up the economies of the rest of the world so that they may be open to servicing the needs of the major capitalist economies. This is the first major point. Now, in this story, imperialism was initially in the early stages of industrial capitalism, it took the form of what one writer called the expansion of England to create the biggest empire the world ever had. However, the rest of the world was not going to take subordination, economic subordination lying down. And in the early period of the expansion of England, many countries, or some important countries, including Germany, the United States, and Japan, essentially industrialized through processes of state-led development behind protectionist walls in order to challenge the dominance of the UK on the world market. And the result was that already by the late 19th century, the world had become multipolar. Because this type of imperialism elicits a resistance of the sort that you already saw in the early instances in the United States, Germany, Japan, etc. The only way of resisting imperialism is to engage in this sort of state-led development. But at the time these three countries industrialized, enough of the world remained open to colonization that this led more or less immediately to a competition for colonies, and in the late 19th century. The problem with the United States, however, is that it never acquired a very substantial empire, chiefly because it arrived at this game rather late, because up until the very end of the 19th century, it was involved in the project of essentially internal colonization. So the United States arrives at this moment late. So, and also one of my main points is that The high point of imperialism is reached already in 1914. After that, imperialism has been declining. If you want to prove how radical you are by saying that imperialism is just as strong, you are going to lose a lot of accuracy. The radicalism lies in understanding that imperialism is declining and in the process of its decline, becoming desperate, irresponsible, and harder and harder to control. So the eventual result of this process of imperialism has been challenges by anti-imperialist countries. After the US, Germany, Japan, etc., you also had the challenges represented by socialist countries, preeminently, of course, the Soviet Union and China. So by the early 20th century, when the United States, seeing that Britain was getting weaker and aspiring to take Britain's place, the United States essentially wanted to become the leading capitalist country, but it had the historical misfortune of getting its opportunity of doing this precisely when the world had become too multipolar for the US to succeed, even though the United States actually moderated its ambitions by saying we will never acquire an empire of the size Britain has. We will have to settle for making the dollar the world's money and essentially trying to keep the world economy open through other means. So, and of course, this ambition is essentially what gets theorized as the theory of US hegemony. My argument has always been that the US hegemony was never accomplished. What we have is a series of attempts to try to accomplish it. And today, the United States' ability to achieve this is lower than ever before. The United States has made the most zealous attempts, but has not succeeded. The United States had to do this in the context not only of great multipolarity, but in a context where socialism, which is a superior form of productive organization, had already emerged. So the United States fails to achieve economic dominance. In fact, the relative economic size has declined over time. Its ability to exert financial control has only led to more and more financial crises and increasing contradictions within the dollar system, which I have explored in Geopolitical Economy, and Michael and I have also written about it together. So what has become clear in the 21st century is that if it's failing to exert economic control, financial control, diplomatic control, it is also failing to exert military control. Already, we have had previously a major moment under the Carter presidency when for a brief while, President Carter thought he was going to throw in the towel, give up the project of American dominance and accept that the United States cannot achieve this goal. Then under Reagan and successive presidents, this project was revived, particularly with the collapse of the Soviet Union. This project got a huge boost, at least subjectively, but objectively, the conditions were not there for the successful achievement. And that's why you got the Trump moment. The Carter moment was matched by the Trump moment. Trump was not exactly particularly, concerned about the rest of the world or anything, but he, due to political compulsions, was forced to turn his attention inwards to rectifying, at least appearing to rectify US problems. And he was the only president of recent times not to start a new war. That's also quite interesting. What Biden is trying to do at the present moment is actually to salvage the US project. And in this, NATO is very central. This is the last set of points I want to make about NATO. So NATO, essentially, you have to realize that NATO has been created as part of the US's inability to accept the actual principles of the United Nations. So NATO is a sort of a rival organization, a rival collective security organization whose aims are actually to preserve capitalism, to advance US capital in particular, in violation of the anti-imperialist principles embedded in the United States. And NATO is the weapon of choice of the US, and it is key to Biden's strategy. Biden realizes that the United States cannot achieve world dominance on its own. It needs its allies. Its allies need to be on side. So that is why Biden has essentially elaborated this idea of the United States being creating an alliance of democracies against so-called autocracies. And of course, NATO is central to this. But as we could see in the Vilnius summit, this project is already unraveling. The Vilnius summit was focused on Ukraine and Russia, but of course, as we know, the Russia-China war are linked. And I have argued in a piece I recently published in Counterpunch that essentially the way to see the linkage between the Russia war and the looming war and a potential war on China is this. The United States wants the Europeans essentially to come on side, is using the war against Russia to bring the Europeans on side, to leave them with no opportunity, no alternative, but to side with the United States when the United States launches a potential war against China. Why is Russia important? Because historically, although notwithstanding all the rhetoric of NATO, et cetera, the fact of the matter has been that that Europe has actually historically been rather difficult to keep on side. Every so often, whether it's in the Ostpolitik of Willy Brandt, or more recently, attempts by the Europeans to try to create their own common security and defense policy, the Europeans have tried to assert their autonomy vis-a-vis the United States. And that autonomy will always require good relations with Russia. So because Russia sits right next door, Russia is also capable of supplying a lot of what Europe needs in terms of resources and so on. So historically, this has always been the case. By launching this war against Russia over Ukraine, the United States wants the Europeans to sever all ties with Russia and to be reduced to dependence on the US in such a way that it can be sure of getting Europeans on side. So historically, the way in which the US has disrupted the process of better relations between Western Europe and Russia is by demonstrating its military might. The US did it in Yugoslavia. In Yugoslavia, essentially disrupted a European attempt to try to create a European security structure, particularly a German attempt, by essentially intervening in the war and not permitting the war to be decided on Germany's terms. So then it succeeded, and therefore it was able to keep the Europeans on side, not only keep it on side, but even to expand NATO, essentially to piggyback the process of NATO expansion on the process of EU expansion. So this subordination was achieved, but this time it is very clear that the military factor, which is all the United States has left, essentially, is going to fail. And this we know because already in the 21st century, we have had a series of military failures on the part of the United States. I mean, quite frankly, even before the 21st century, I mean, Korea and Vietnam were not exactly shining successes of United States military strategy. So the military angle, the military element is going to be shown to be not to be the US's strong suit. So essentially, and of course, amid all this, there has also been the rise of China. So the United States has been declining economically. It has lost diplomatic influence. Now it faces clear military defeat in a war for which it has asked the Europeans to sacrifice an enormous amount. If it fails in this, then the Europeans, it cannot be sure of getting Europeans on side. But let me also say that if the Europeans had been reluctant to be dragged into the war with Russia, they will be even more reluctant to be dragged in any war with China because they have a lot more invested in their relationship with China. The relationship with China has been growing ever more thick. So essentially, this is a time of division on a number of fronts. First of all, ordinary people in Europe as well as the United States are increasingly not in favor of wars. They do not want the war against Russia. They do not want any war against China. There will also, for reasons I've just given, be divisions between the US and Europe, both on Russia and on China. And finally, there were already divisions among the elites of the various countries. There are elites in the United States, including corporate elites, who do not want to have a war with China. There are pro-Chinese and anti-Chinese corporates, essentially different parts of the US business world that benefit from a war in China, and those that do not benefit from a war with China. So in this, that is why, as I said, this war is bound to be messy, confused, and ultimately it is not going to be a win for the United States. But of course, if it is attempted, if a military conflict is actually attempted, it has the potential not only to do a lot of damage, but to bring the world to nuclear war. Thank you very much.